here. So get ready. I see some folks coming on. Here.
We're just in a virtual meeting with Regent Rolfe, so he should be close by.
Yes. Jeff, I made you a co-host as well, so you can share your screen when we get to that stage. We'll see if Troy hops on here.
Regent Winter, have you guys received the 7 to 10 inches of snow that you were supposed to get in the Lawrence area? Can't hear you, Wint. You're not muted, but can't hear you. Not sure why.
Might be I was having an issue with my microphone earlier. It didn't know which microphone to pick up on. So I'm not normally at home for these things, so that little up arrow next to the audio might, selecting that and selecting a different microphone might help.
Or there's always reboot. That's always the ultimate solution.
Now rebooting and joining again is always the option.
Well, in Regent Winter, when your sound came through earlier, it was coming through on your iPad. So if your computer mic isn't working, that may be an option, is for you to do the meeting on your iPad versus on your computer.
Where's my good friend Ethan at? I'm worried about him. Where is he?
Just email me, so I'm thinking he's going to be coming on shortly.
Good morning. How is everyone?
Morning, Ethan. All right, Regent Dicus, you're able to hear us okay?
I can. Can you hear me?
We can, yes.
Perfect.
All right, well, I've got 10:15, so we will go ahead and get started. Wish obviously we could see all of you in person today, but obviously your everyone's safety and security is the most important thing. So I hope you're all staying warm and safe on this Wednesday morning. Obviously today's meeting is virtual only, with all members of the committee as well as board staff, university staff, and the public listening online. I will ask everyone who is in the Zoom meeting to please go ahead and mute your microphones. If a regent or a staff member has comments or questions, please unmute yourself and ask to be recognized. And when I recognize someone, everyone else should keep their microphones muted. And as a matter of fact, I will probably, in between action items, I'll probably have my microphone muted. Our city crews don't get to use their snow plows that often. So I have no doubt that that they'll go by no fewer than 20 times over the next 45 minutes or so. So I will do that myself. Each time you're recognized to speak, would ask that you state your name and maybe the first time that you speak, your title as well, so that you can be readily identified by the listeners as well as observers. For presentations that we'll be enjoying today, the screen will be shared for everyone to view the materials. There aren't that many action items today. Really the only scheduled action items, approve the minutes from the last meeting, and then also the consent agenda for this afternoon's meeting. If there are any other action items, I will just ask for a motion and a second, obviously, and then Vice President Frisbee would take a roll call vote to determine how each committee member is voting, and then she'll announce the results of that vote. We will not do a roll call for the minutes, and we don't have a motion, a second, or a vote to recess or adjourn the meeting. I would also note that the agenda materials we are referencing today are posted, as they always are, to the Board of Regents website, where board agendas are published. So no further ado, we'll move into old business. First up,
Blake.
yes, sir. Yeah.
Elaine Went called me and said that he was removed from the meeting and he can't get back in.
We can see him.
It must be his iPad. Okay, so
We are able to see you,
Okay.
Regent Winter.
send him a chat.
He said something about the host. He tried to get back in. He said the host wouldn't allow him, but like you said, you can see him.
Uh,
Went, are you able to hear us? Okay, he's able to hear us and we're able to see him. So we're halfway there.
all right, wait, Regent Winter, do you see the chat I sent you? So if you have a question or a concern, you send us a chat back. Okay.
Okay.
Very
All right.
good.
Sounds good. All right, we'll move into, thank you for stopping us there, Regent Dicus. Old business, would entertain any discussion related to our minutes from the January 15th committee meeting. Those are on page 46 through 48 of the board agenda. There's no discussion. Would entertain
Regent
a motion to
Menzel?
approve.
This is Regent
sir.
Rolfe. I'd move to approve.
Okay, we have a motion from Regent Rolfe.
Regent
Second.
Dicus, John would second that.
Okay.
Or
Second by Regent Dicus. Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
aye.
All right, minutes are approved. Secondly, follow up on issues raised during the January 28th teleconference call. My notes don't indicate any, but I wanted to leave that opportunity for any of my regents. Any follow up from the January 28th call? Right.
All good here.
Okay. Hearing none, we will move into new business. Review State University's annual financial reports, including the composite financial index and current year budget status relative to plan. And before we get into our three universities that'll be reporting this morning, ask Troy Brune, who's the Associate Vice President of Financial Reporting, to just give us a brief overview of the CFI, as that could be helpful for us this morning. So with that, Troy, I'll turn it over to you. Good morning.
All right, good morning. Good morning, everyone. I guess you've heard this same presentation the last couple of years. I'm honored that you invited me back and you wanted to hear it again. I'll give you just a refresher on the CFI and how you can use it. It will jump right in. Please stop, ask questions. Otherwise, I'll just fly through these slides. Let's see. Okay, the CFI, it has been around for decades. It is a benchmarking tool. It's used by both private and public institutions of higher ed, and also by the Higher Learning Commission. And it is comprised of 4 separate ratios that are combined, weighted into the CFI. At the end of the presentation, I'll present CFI through the lens of a student's grade point average. So the CFI is at the end of the process. The CFIs that you're reviewing now is based on information from each institution's audited financial statements for June 30 of 24. So the CFI is definitely not an early warning index, but it is a useful tool for you to use. It also serves the purpose of providing regents a snapshot and an indication of the financial health, so you don't have to dig down into the details. These are the 4 ratios. Each answer a specific question. The primary reserve is an institution's resources. Are they flexible and sufficient enough to support their mission? The viability reserve, it also includes resources, but adds debt and answers the question, is it strategically managed? And return on net assets analyzes asset performance. And finally, net operating revenue gives you an indication of the operating results for the fiscal year. The next 4 slides show you how each ratio is calculated. If for some reason, after my presentation, you want to try it out yourself, I've given you how to make those calculations. I'll skip through these. And here is Wichita State's information for FY24, primary reserve. The benchmark is 0.4, which would equal about 4.8 months of net assets available for the institution. Wichita State ended the year with 4.5. Now, going back to an institution's strategic plan and its operations, that number should not surprise the institution at the end of the year. And for Wichita State, a growing institution, we expect our liquidity and net assets to be a little thin because we're growing. If there's an institution that is not growing, they may have an issue if the benchmark is below 4. The viability ratio includes debt. The benchmark is 1.0, and that's an indication the institution has enough unrestricted net assets to sufficiently service its debt. Wichita State is slightly lower, but in our instance, more than 75% of the institution's debt is serviced by restricted revenues from housing, parking, and the Board of Trustees. Return on net assets, benchmark is anything greater than 0. So the institution had a positive return on net assets. And finally, net operating revenue, which is missing the E. As long as it is above 0, that is an indication that the results of operations were positive for the year. The CFI is best analyzed over a period of time, because a snapshot at the end of 1 year doesn't really give you a lot of information. So here's Wichita State's, the green line at the top is the CFI, and individual ratios are shown below. Now, the CFI not only includes Wichita State itself, but all of its component units or affiliates. So this includes the foundation and the foundation returns. If I look at return on net assets compared to the CFI, you can see that the return on net assets pretty much dictates how the CFI is going to move. In these return on net assets, that is the investment returns of the foundation's endowment. So that is a large amount of money, and it has a great impact on the institution's CFI. And this just gives you an indication of if an institution's overall CFI is below 3, there might be some questions to be asked and some work to be done on the strategic plan, the implementation of the plan, etc. But the benchmark is a CFI of 3 or greater, indicates the institution is in solid financial health. Again, multiple year analysis. You can focus on the individual ratios and why they changed, and that helps tell the story. And please keep in mind, CFI only measures the financial activities, and the analysis of the institution must include non-financial activities and impacts to tell the whole story. I'm going to slide back a couple of slides. Y'all remember John Bardo? He came to campus in 2012 with his big vision, and you can see we had good investment return on net assets through the foundation, but the CFI dropped dramatically. If the university didn't have a strategic plan in place, that would have been alarming. But the university expected that drop because they were implementing the strategic plan. So it's the story behind the ratios that you need to dig into. Whoop. And finally, I like this. I'm not going to take credit that I came up with this. I found it from another presentation. A presenter showed CFI as a GPA. And if you were just looking at the GPA, most people would think student 1 and student 2 were the best students. But when you dig into the individual classes, you can see that student 3 got 5 Bs. There was an issue with student 1 and 2, but it's not reflected in the final GPA, similar to an institution's CFI. So there may be something other than the student's ability in the class impacting that grade. Similar to an institution's CFI in the individual ratios, there might be something other than financial that is impacting the final numbers. I went through that really fast. If you have any questions, I would be happy to answer them.
No, that's great information, Troy, and I appreciate the update on that. It's a great tool, and I know we've got some new folks. So I just thought it would be good for everybody to hear just kind of a refresher on what exactly the CFI is and how you come up with it. So, any questions or clarifications for Troy? All right. Hearing none. Troy, thank you for your time this morning.
Thank you all.
All right, we will now move into financial reports from 3 of our institutions that'll be joining us this morning. First up, we have from Pittsburgh State University, Mr. Doug Ball. Good morning, Doug.
Good morning. Thank you, Regent Benson and committee. Let me share my screen and get it going. All right, can everyone see the presentation? All right, fantastic. Well, we will be spending a few minutes sharing with you, as we do every year, the kind of mid-year update on our financial results, including our CFI and some other relevant items. As we've done in prior years, there's a number of somewhat standardized reports that we'll include as we have in prior years, and then I'll try to highlight some of the key observations that I see in these results. Let's start with a couple of enrollment-related items. This would all be information you've seen before, but as a reminder, this first one's showing fall FTE by residency. You'll notice in an aggregate basis, a real stabilization of those enrollment trends over the last couple of years. As you dive a little deeper, I think there's maybe 2 noteworthy items. On the positive side, we've seen freshman enrollment up for the 4th consecutive year. Not large increases, small to moderate increases each year, but just the sequence of seeing it now for 4 years in a row is a positive and has been an important factor in kind of driving that stabilization of enrollment. On the other side, one area of focus of maybe short-term concern is the international enrollment. After a significant increase a year ago, we did see a drop back a little bit this year in the fall semester. And so that's one we're continuing to monitor to understand the impact. We're still up considerably versus where we were a few years ago. But again, gave back some of that increase from last year. And so we'll be watching that closely. That is a trend that continued into the spring as well. All right, moving to credit hour production, really a very similar trend. It aligns almost identically with the FTE numbers. So again, a real stabilization over the last couple of years after a period of decline. Nothing really particularly additional or noteworthy here that I wanted to highlight. All right, moving on to financial items, and let's focus first on the current fiscal year 25. And this is intended to be the mid-year checkpoint where we illustrate how are we doing relative to our plan, relative to our budget. So this is showing the general use budget, right? The core budget that covers the academic and administrative functions of the university. And let's look at two primary items. On the top half of the chart, we see the revenues. I focus in on that tuition revenue to make sure we're on track to hit our plan for tuition revenues. You can see at the midpoint of the year, we are at the midpoint of hitting our budget. So we're very much on track with where we expected to be. Fall tuition revenues were right in line with what we expected. And so now with spring and spring and summer to be completed, really anticipating we're going to be very close to that tuition budget number. Again, the international softness that we saw in the fall and again are seeing in the spring puts a little bit of pressure on that number. And so we may see just a little bit of softness in the spring tuition collections. Really haven't finalized that number yet, but anticipate there may be some opportunity in the summer to keep us right on budget. We're certainly going to be close, if not right on budget for the year. So solid news there. And then the bottom half of the chart shows expenditures against budget. We typically run just a little bit under 50% in the first 6 months of the year, and then see just slightly higher expenditures in the second half of the year. And so that 47% overall spend rate of budget through December, is really very consistent with what we've seen in prior years, maybe just slightly below, say our average over the last several years is maybe closer to 48%. But generally speaking, again, right in line with expectations. And in digging a little deeper and looking at some of the specifics that are driving that, nothing concerning comes to mind. And I think we're right on track to be on or maybe even just slightly under budget on the spending side for the year. So no items of concern. Everything really points to a financially stable year this year. Moving on to looking backwards in time. So this is showing the completed year, fiscal year 24, the prior year, and then a 5-year trend leading up to that year. This is showing total expenditures, so not just those general use expenditures we talked about on the prior page, but all forms of expenditures from all funds. Shows the trend over time, right? A couple of things I would highlight, particularly if you look at the last couple of years. There are increases across a lot of categories driven by inflation and new programs and salary increases and so forth. But two I would really highlight is the academic support line and the student services line. Larger increases in those two areas, particularly if you look over the last 2 years. That's where you're going to see all of the expenditures associated with our student success initiatives. So our new student advising program, all of the related support for that student advising program, and some other student success related programs are all captured in those two lines. And so that's the preponderance of that increase as we've made that significant investment over the last couple of years. Right, one of the topics I always enjoy looking at a little more closely as we prepare for this presentation is tuition rates and how are our tuition rates stacking up against various comparison points and how have they changed from the prior year. And so this first page shows our tuition rates compared to our two peer groups, right? The board selected peers on the top and the aspirational peers on the bottom. Generally speaking, this looks very similar to the way it has the last couple of years, but let me just highlight a few interesting elements. On that top half graph, you'll see that we remain lower than 4 of the 5 peer institutions. That's exactly where we were last year. The one exception, the one that is lower than us, is Valdosta State. We've talked about that in prior years. Georgia made a very significant investment in higher education a couple of years ago, and as a result, all of their institutions actually lowered their tuition by a material amount. And that moved Valdosta from being fairly similar to us, actually just slightly higher than us, to being just modestly lower than us. And so that continues to be the case this year. Another thing I looked at this year is just the rate of increase year over year for each of these institutions versus us. 4 of the 5 had larger increases than the 3.5% we did this past year. So generally speaking, those gaps grew bigger in terms of being higher than us by not large amounts, but by modest amounts. Similar story on the bottom side. So the bottom side are aspirational peers, meaning that most of these institutions are a bit larger than us and have a bit broader set of programs and activities, but are similar in some regards. And again, you'll see that we're lower in this case than all 5 of those institutions. We've been neck and neck with Cal State Chico over the last couple of years. We were slightly higher than them a year ago. We're slightly lower than them this year. They had a larger increase than we did. Again, and same story as above, the majority of these institutions did see higher increases than we did this past year. All right, another comparison that I find valuable is comparing to institutions that are geographically closer. These are the institutions in our athletic conference, the MIAA. So all of them are similar regional institutions and all relatively close. We've stayed in the exact same position this year as we were last year, and really have been the last couple of years relative to this group of institutions. And so I think we're in a good spot. One of the noted things I saw in updating the data for this year is that group of 5 institutions just to our left, so just higher than us, all 5 of them saw higher increases this past year than we did. And so that gap, while it's not large, that gap between where we're at 4,200 and where that group to our left is grew a bit larger this year. It's a bit tighter a year ago. And so we see that position of being really at the low end of that middle quadrant kind of strengthening over the past year. All right, moving on to CFI, and I can reference a couple of things and show you another example of a couple of things Troy mentioned a minute ago. On the left-hand side, this shows our graph of CFI over time. You will see we've had a fairly sizable increase this past year, 1.6 points. But as Troy noted, really the trend over a longer period of time is probably more relevant and more interesting. So let's break down both of those components and talk about them. First of all, the longer trend over time, you see a fairly consistent increase over the last 8 years or so. It's been an intentional effort to reduce debt, to manage expenses, to be disciplined, and to put ourselves in a little stronger financial position. And we've seen that happen over time. I will tell you the increase this past year is likely temporary. It's really driven by some cyclical factors or some temporary factors that wouldn't be expected to last over the long haul. And they're a good example of what Troy was referencing about how you have to dig a little deeper really to understand what's going on. In our case, the majority of that 1.6 points of increase was driven by 2 things. First of all, our foundation had a strong investment return this past year, an above average return. That's a sizable enough item that it does impact the CFI results to a noticeable degree. And so while we were pleased with that return, it was at a level we certainly wouldn't expect every year. And so that's likely to come back to the average over time. And then the second, and this is really maybe a bigger factor, as I've had a chance to understand and use CFI for several years now, I've come to really appreciate the impact that investment plans and investment strategies have on the result. Those can be any kind of investment. In this case, they're really facility investments. And so we've been preparing for facility investments. And if you think about that cycle that you go through where you will accumulate assets and accumulate resources, in anticipation of some projects, then invest in those projects and spend those funds, and then reap the benefits of those funds. You often go through a little cyclical cycle of CFI results, right? The resource accumulation will improve your CFI temporarily. Then you'll spend all of those funds on the project, and that will lower your CFI for a period of time. And then you reap the benefits operationally of those investments, and you see it rebound a little bit. We're at the high point of that cycle. We've been accumulating resources for a large tunnel project that we've talked about in the past that's important to our infrastructure, and then certainly also to the Gorilla Rising project in the College of Business. And so we're really at the high point of having accumulated some of the resources necessary to complete those projects. CFI is at its high point in that cycle. Over the next 18 months, we'll be investing all of those resources. And so I fully expect the CFI to drop a bit in the next year or two as we make those investments. Right now we're probably at the high range of what I would consider the ideal target for us. As Troy mentioned, every institution's a little different and a little different mission, a little different set of circumstances. In our case, I've really zeroed in on 3 to 6 as being an ideal range for us to strive to be within with our CFI, at least most of the time. We're at the very high end of that range now. We'll probably drop back into the middle of that range as we make those investments over the coming years. Debt service has not changed in the last year, and so this is similar to what I showed you a year ago. But just as a reminder, really kind of 2 noteworthy things here. You can see we have had a substantial reduction in debt service over the last about 8 years. That's a function of 2 things, 2 significant refinancings that occurred at a very timely basis to reduce our debt service requirements. And then completing some older debt issuances on some older projects that have now fully been paid off. And so we've settled into this new level in the $3+ million range of debt service, and we're going to be and that's what's remaining. There are 2 larger items that are fully funded by housing, parking, and student fee projects, primarily the student center. And so that'll be a fairly stable level for the next 7 or 8 years until those projects run their course as well. And then finally, just a couple of quick charts from our annual financial report this past year. These don't move a lot from year to year, but I think they're a good reminder. The first looks at the expenditure side, and it's just a reminder that compensation and benefits is the preponderance of our costs and remains the preponderance of our costs. The graph shows all funds. From an all funds basis, it tends to run in the mid-50s to mid-60s, varies a little bit from year to year. And then the note at the bottom references the general use budget. So again, the academic and administrative budget tend to run in the 75 to 80% range there. So just a reminder, we're all about the compensation and benefits when you think about our expenditures. And then finally, our revenues across all funds as well, right? Certainly state appropriations and tuition and fees are the big hitters and drive that general use budget we were just talking about. But auxiliary enterprises, housing and dining and so forth, is typically pretty stable in the 10 to 11%. The one noteworthy thing that's been moving over the last 2 or 3 years is the grants and contracts piece of the pie. Right now at 10%, we've seen some slow but steady growth in that area as we've made some greater investments and have some more infrastructure in place, really driving those targeted, very focused areas of research activity. We're starting to see some impacts from that work. Finally, just a couple of comments, kind of my observations on what are some of the key pressure points and strengths that are evolving over time. From a pressure point, looking both at today and into the future, right? It continues to be important that we advocate for maintaining and growing the funding, the state funding and other funding sources that's necessary to allow us to have the regional impact that we have on students, families, and businesses. So that funding will be an important thing to stay focused on. The potential for impacts to enrollment from the enrollment cliff, our admissions and enrollment management teams stay very focused on positioning us as best possible to to weather those demographic challenges that are out there. And then finally, competitive salaries continues to be a challenging point, right? Filling critical positions, high impact positions isn't getting any easier. It continues to be challenging. Retaining key faculty and staff positions is a challenge. And so those are three of the things that we are on our ongoing areas of focus that we will work to manage. And then on the strength side, we're very pleased with that 4-year positive trend in freshman enrollment that I mentioned earlier, with the student achievement activities we've achieved in the last couple of years, including the automatic associate's degree, the student success initiatives, and the impact that is having and will have on retention. On the more robust and more targeted or really more strategic Great Gorilla Scholarship Program that's doing a better job of supporting students through their academic objectives. The Gorilla Rising Project, both the College of Business component to that and the student housing component to that. I'll just mention in passing, I had a chance to see some of the further design work that's happened on the student housing portion of the Gorilla Rising Project. It's very exciting. Looking forward to showing some information about that to you when you visit Pittsburgh in April. And then finally, we continue to be excited about the expanded community engagement efforts that we have underway through our targeted applied research and economic development programs, and continuing to see exciting results from all of those. With that, I'm happy to entertain any questions or discuss anything else you may have.
All right. Thank you, Doug. Questions for Doug Ball this morning? Yes, Regent Winter.
Good morning. Doug, very good presentation. Your preparation was obvious, very tight, well-focused. Thank you for preparing so well. With respect to the associate's degree concept that you all have implemented, is there any way to identify at this point how many more students we have on campus or remotely because of that? Or is it just too early to tell?
I think it might be a little bit early. Certainly the specific metric we would have at this point is the number of students that we have granted that associate's degree to through the first couple of cycles. I don't recall that number off the top of my head, but I can get that and forward that to you. That's certainly a leading indicator of some potential help in strengthening that challenging point that we've had with retention in past years, which is the sophomore to junior year. And so I think we're probably one cycle away from being able to maybe share something more definitive on the impact it's having on that particular retention item. We did see a positive step in that this year, but I think we need to see it one more cycle to feel confident that it's tied in a meaningful way to that program.
One other question. Of all of the positives that you've gone through, which one of those do you think is the most meaningful, the most important, the one you're most proud of?
Well, that's a tricky question because I would have a hard time picking one.
Well, I'm a tricky lawyer, so you expect
fair enough. If you made me pick one, if you'd let me do two, one in the short run and one maybe in the longer run, right? In the short run, I think those student success initiatives, both the associate's degree, but also the advising center and the new approach to advising, I think that's incredibly important and incredibly impactful. The one that's a little further out that I'm extremely excited about is the Gorilla Rising Project. I think the Gorilla Rising Project is going to have a meaningful impact, not only for business students where we're doing the business activity, but in a broader way across our community and our entire student population as well. So I'm excited to see that fall into place here in the next 15 months or so.
Well, it's exciting to see the progress that you all have made, and you're a big part of it. Of course, the president's doing a great job in leadership. So I'm excited to watch the improvement, the progress. Keep it up.
Yeah, you are too.
All right, other questions for Doug this morning? Good questions by Regent Winter. Well, Doug, I'll just echo what Regent Winter said. Thank you not only for the great information, just thank you for your leadership on that campus. I'm also excited about the work that you and President Chip and Provost Bond have done to really reform the scholarship programs to make those more comprehensive. So they're not just the first year. I think that's going to have a big impact on retention moving forward as well. So thank you again for all you do. All right, moving on. Next up from the University of Kansas this morning, Jeff DeWitt. Good morning, Jeff. You're still muted, Jeff.
Can you hear me now?
There we go. We got you.
And can you see my presentation?
We can.
Thank you for having me today to talk about this. We have some real positive news financially, and we have some significant challenges going forward, which I'll talk about at the end. Thank good we're in a position we're in to start addressing some of those, and I'll talk about that a little bit in a minute. Just in terms of the structure, I'll walk you through our structure. We're both the medical center and the Lawrence campus, as well as Wichita campus and other areas, the Olathe Edwards campus. I'll give you some mid-year updates. Our enrollment, which is really a really positive story, our educational cost, tuition fees, our general use budget, our operating expenditures, debt service, and our CFI, and then some of the key challenges, which I want to spend some time talking about going forward. This just shows you we're really two universities, but we're now operating as one KU under a new structure from the chancellor. I'm now the CFO of all campuses. David Varadkar is now the chief operating officer of all campuses. We have one HR director, one chief research strategist, a whole different setup that we've been operating under for the last 10 months, which is really, really showing a lot of return, and particularly as we're facing some of the challenges that we're facing. And you can see we have Center for Research, Moral Union, Kansas Athletics on the Lawrence campus, the Research Institute, Student Union on the medical campus, and obviously endowment, the health system, which we're also more tightly integrated in than ever, and then the University of Kansas physician. So it's a pretty complicated entity. Some mid-year updates. We have our largest freshman class in history, our largest enrollment in history. Our 2025 applications indicate another strong freshman class. So we expect to grow again as we drop off one of our smaller classes, probably our last one, and bring on a larger class. And then our 5-year general use budget is balanced for the first time in 5+ years. So we are at a point where our revenues and our expenses are balanced through several strategic initiatives that have come into play. And you'll see that reflected somewhat in the trend of the CFI. And you'll see that in other things that we're able to now do. Campus master plan is completed. Phase 1 of the Gateway Stadium project's under construction, will be open August 2025, funded with state funding, ARPA, donor and athletics debt that is being issued for that based upon the revenue generated by the project. Medical center campus enrollment remains steady. Research enterprise continues strong growth, very strong growth at the medical center, particularly in the area of cancer and other areas. A new cancer center project underway and a joint clinical and research facility, a $500 million plus joint facility that we have requested the legislature $100 million of debt authority to finish up the funding for that. And then the new Wichita Biomedical Education Campus is proceeding with Wichita State to state funded. So
Jeff,
a lot going on. Yes.
just real quick clarification. Am I safe to assume this presentation is not going to include any changes to NIH funding until that gets sorted out through court?
I will talk about that at the end because that's
Okay.
a really good question.
But what we're seeing would assume that that's still full payment, right?
I will show you what we're going to have to do if there's changes made. I'll talk about
All right.
that.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. This is a really dramatic chart that shows a really significant change in enrollment strategy, scholarshiping. Thank you to the state for the scholarship funds. Thank you for all the support on the NIST playbook and other things that have helped out a great deal. And we've invested in a lot in out-of-state recruitment. We've changed the way we recruit, we changed the way we scholarship, and you can see a radical shift that happened in 2023 as a result of that strategy change. And we have, again, the record highest freshman enrollment in 2024, fall 24, another one this year. And you can see the impacts of graduating 3,800 and adding 5,100. The COVID class graduating and a new class coming on play, which has done a lot to address our structural challenges that we've had. This is university-wide student FTEs. You can see in total, our total enrollment's at a record level as well. And you can see the non-resident growth is pretty substantial. A little bit of growth in resident, but largely non-resident. Not unlike Doug just talked about, international remains to be a challenge just to keep that where it is. But again, largest largest total enrollment in history, which has placed challenge on things like our student housing and some of our classrooms and having enough faculty. So, this growth doesn't come without some expenses that go with it. And so I think we've addressed that. And we're now at a point of strategy where we don't really want to grow anymore on campus. We'll have this class next year, and I think our goal is to work diligently to try to maintain that. But our plan for growth in the future is more on competency-based education and online, global online learning and graduate programs and things like that, because I think infrastructure-wise, growing more would be very expensive. And it's the right size class for the community and everything else. And so we're about where we want to be. Our goal is to maintain that and grow in other ways. Again, this is our student credit hours, large growth in that area, commensurate with the change in enrollment you can see there. This is a typical graph that we often show that shows the difference between the gap between what the state funds and what tuition funds. And you can see that's come together closer in the past few years, but there's still a gap in terms of students pay a larger share than the state does in terms of funding the cost of education. This is our peer group, and we're very proud of staying where we are. Particularly, I'm not really sure what's going on, but Missouri had some pretty large increases more historically. They have moved pretty much out of our range. We're close to Indiana and Iowa in terms of our costs. We're in the lower quartile, I would call lower group of our peer group of institutions we compare ourselves to. So we want to try to maintain that competitiveness as well. This is not dissimilar to what Doug showed a minute ago, and it's the same pattern here where a little over 50% of our revenue, a little over 47% of our expenses, just like Pittsburgh State for different reasons, our expenses come in a little faster toward the end. So this is exactly on track to the trend that we're going to be right on budget, maybe slightly below where we plan to be. And you can see kind of 50% of revenue, 47% of expenses on track to where we want to be on the Lawrence campus. And on the medical center campus, comes in a little bit differently because of how money flows in, particularly state funding in other areas. So you can see 32% of expenses, 32% of expenditures. We expect that to be on track as well. That's just the pattern they normally run there. And then this shows you the historical trend that we've experienced. And you can see, instruction has grown, research has grown, support services have grown as the classes have grown. And support services reflects the NIST playbook money, which we are at record retention levels from freshman to sophomore to junior to senior. So that has really paid off. It not only brings in revenue to grow, it brings in revenue to keep the people you have all the way through 4 years. So all this has been incredibly successful for us dealing with our fiscal challenges we had 4 or 5 years ago to get to a balanced general use budget and be able to do things we want to do going forward. This shows you our expenses, just like all the other schools, about 2/3 of its compensation and benefits, very similar, $1.7 million. Our debt burden has decreased significantly as we've not issued any debt since 2016. For the Central District, you can see we're at 6.1% in 2020, the percent of expenditures, and down to 4.55% today. We spoke to Moody's yesterday, the Chancellor and I did, and we spoke to Standard & Poor's as part of their regular surveillance, and our debt burden is low relative to our peer size schools and peer AA level credit ratings. And even bringing on $100 million of cancer center debt and $115 million of athletic debt and $60 million of School of Architecture and $100 million for housing, we will still be below what we were in 2021. So we've done enough to be able to bring on some critical infrastructure projects we're planning in the coming year, the Gateway Project, Cancer Center, School of Architecture, and housing, and still keep our debt below where it was, pre-COVID or in the middle of COVID. So we're very proud of that and talked a lot about that with him yesterday about how we manage that. This is our CFI, which, if you look at the trend, as was mentioned earlier, you can see our CFI is all the way up to 8, which is, where you can really start making critical investments and start really taking things to another level when you get to that level. Now that, like Doug said earlier, that's largely driven by very large returns on the endowment, over 9% that they earned that year. So that's somewhat of that trend going up. But that trend is also the fact that we've gotten operating margins we're generating on the Lawrence campus where they were running deficits. So that viability of generating net revenue, that viability of your investments paying off, the viability of student enrollment growing and all those types of things kind of gives you that trend. And if you were to go back, to 2012, 2013, David Ranicar was here then, that number was down in the 3s as the medical center was trying to turn around. So there's been quite a positive direction. Again, you look at this in total, but you got to look at all factors, what's causing it, and be very cognizant of it. So this is just a point that our trend is strong and good. Here's kind of my last slide that I want to spend some time talking about. We're assuming that we'll continue to get state support and don't get cut. We're assuming that we can maybe get some help with pay going forward, at least somewhat, given that we've been paid below what our other state peers have been in terms of increases. And pay is a really, really big issue that if you look at it in total for faculty, staff recruitment and retention, our total gap, because we've done the study and we've submitted that part of the process, that's $29 million annually we would like to do to get our employees all to market so that you're competitive and you're always keeping the best and brightest. And the general use side of that's about 20 million just for the Lawrence campus. So that's something we want to address. State funding levels just don't hurt us, keep us where we are, and help us with the cost of living increases that we're facing, particularly on the pay side, is our request there. The one that Regent Rolfe, you mentioned, is the uncertainty of federal funding. If you're not aware in the news, there's a change to NIH grants, which are largely is 80+% of the grants at the medical center, changing the percent you get for support services to run those grants. And medical research is not cheap. It's not just the research itself, it's buying the equipment, it's having the wet labs, it's paying for all the things you need to do the research, which is how the grants have historically been structured. And so we are in the process of analyzing that and say, okay, if this is a new world, if this is where we end up, how are we going to navigate that? We're in a strong financial position on both campuses now, or at least stronger. What are we going to have to invest in that to keep our research growing and to keep us going forward in the event the world changes in terms of federal support for grants? Do we need to look at other funding sources? Do we need to look at different types of partnerships? Do we need to look at what our priorities are and change those to continue to grow our research, particularly the area of cancer? So we had all-day meetings on that the last 2 days, just discussing strategies, not just waiting for something to happen, but in the event it does, how are we going to navigate and manage that? And when you have a really smart faculty and staff, and you have really committed professionals, and you have where we are, it gives us the ability to try to navigate this hopefully better than other people can to address that. The other one that relates to that is we have 5 chairs being recruited at the School of Medicine right now. 5 chairs, critical positions for instruction and teaching and research. And the tenure issue that's before the legislature is a big concern for us because it may be very hard to land. We're in the final stages of startup package negotiations and other factors like that, and tenure is going to be an issue. And so we're concerned about that as well, and making sure that that does not harm us competitively, because it's pay, it's benefits, it's where's your future going, it's when people want to come here, do you have a direction? Do they want to be part of that team where it's going? All those things matter. And then we're all dealing with cybersecurity threats and rapidly changing IT environment. And thank you to the state, and thank you to the Board of Regents for helping us address that. That NITS evaluations going on for all of us as we speak. Facility upgrades, maintenance of new facilities. We're continuing to work to address that. We've made lots of headway there with support from the state funding, which I'm not sure it's going to get restored again this year, but that is something you gotta have great labs to attract great researchers, great benefit and competitive pay. So it all kind of goes together. And then, the one we're working diligently on, the Gateway project, provides 448 student housing beds if that phase 2 can get completed. And then the 100 million we asked for the state legislature authority, you and the state for authority to issue debt on, would help us build at least another 600 plus beds to address our student housing. We are putting pressure on the community in terms of affordable housing because we're leasing 1,000 spaces that we don't own. And so we want to get that addressed so that we can have a sustainable long-term positive recruitment experience there. It's a good problem to have. Before we were wondering whether we could fill our housing out. Now we're working to get quality housing in place for the long term. So I'm not going to complain about that when we're working through that problem. And then the one that all Power 4 and any Division I schools are dealing with is the national court case related to athletics. There's a starting July 1, assuming the House case judge settles in April or comes to conclusion in April, a revenue share of $20.5 million with no identified funding source necessary to how you're going to pay for that. The chancellor spoke to that at the Department of Commerce in testimony, and he spoke on some of the other topics I just mentioned in testimony. But that's another one we're working through. The good news is we have the ability to address these things better than we've ever had. The difficult part is, what's your priority? How are you going to do this? What are you maybe not going to do if you have to do all these things? So I am ecstatic we are where we are. I don't like looking at that list saying, well, okay, we got to figure all that. We will figure it all out. But it's not like we need to continue to be supported as we work through these challenges. And I don't think this is probably any different for any research university in the country or anyone with a big sports program or trying to get to market pay and all those challenges. So I don't want to leave on a negative note, where that CFI that you saw of 8 gives you the ability to address this better than ever before, but it might take longer, and it might it will require some thinking, some discussion, and some strategy to get through all this. So that's the end of my presentation. Be glad to take any questions.
All right, thank you, Jeff. Questions for Jeff? Jeff, on your enrollment numbers, if my math is correct, and that's a very big if, looked like about a 20% increase in non-resident enrollment over the last 2 years, if I read that correctly. What would you attribute that?
Totally different strategy. So we look at the funnel, as we call it, at the top of where we're going after students, and we've engaged an outside firm to help us in this area. And we look at what factor, how much scholarship might they need to choose us over Iowa State or Missouri or Colorado or Arizona, but not so much that we end up with not making any money, right? So where's that line between net tuition revenue and making it where we're the better choice for them? And we do that in a very detailed, very logical way, which has allowed us to massively gain on that. And the brand doesn't hurt either on a national basis, but it's that scholarshiping and who do you go after and who do you spend your time on? A lot of strategy changes there.
Okay, thank you. Well done.
Thank you.
Yes, Winter. I think you're still muted, Wint.
I say my smartest things when I'm muted. Jeff, just continuing on the same question with respect to enrollment. You mentioned that the Gateway Project has, if I'm remembering correctly, about 448 more housing units. For you all to embark on that construction, you have to have made an assessment that there will not be a significant enrollment drop, that the cliff will not be as deep as maybe some think. Talk to us just a little bit about how are you making those decisions? What's driving the apparent confidence that you'll have enough enrollment to fill up 248 dorm rooms?
I think that's a great question. We engaged a consultant to help us in a strategic plan for housing and running scenarios of what if it drops as much as people think it is? What if it drops more? What if we stay where we are? The product that we're most oversold on, we don't have enough beds, is apartment style, particularly because of out-of-state enrollment. Out-of-state students, for whatever reasons, prefer the apartment style housing. And so Stouffer Place, which we have the newer Central District, we don't have enough of it. The Gateway District would be a similar product to that, and that would probably meet that demand. We're also going to be tearing down the 2 middle Jayhawk towers here. It's on our plan for demolition, and the outer 2 Jayhawk towers are end of their life as well. They may be at 3 to 5 years left before they need to go down as well. So when you look at what we're leasing, you look at what enrollment drop that may occur, you look at what the products we want. 1,000 units is a safe number, even if we had a drop off to say down to 4,500, which is kind of the high end of a drop we might look at. Still above where we are because of our strategy so different, but lower than where we are. And we look at staying where we are, and we think that 1,000 units, probably 600 of residence hall style, 400 some units of apartment style will be the right mix to help us navigate. We're full. So if a roommate conflict happens, we have challenges, right? Not that 18-year-olds don't always get along when they room together for the first time, but we don't have the ability at the current time to take things offline and maintain them. So 1,000 units would allow us to rotate. It would allow us to keep the right vacancy rate and to keep our facilities maintained so we don't run them into the ground and have to tear them down. So there's a lot of thought that went into that 1,000 unit total new beds that we're looking for. And we made the scenarios of what if enrollment drops. That will give us the ability to rotate and refresh our buildings even better. So that wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing for housing. I wouldn't like it for tuition, but wouldn't be a bad thing for housing.
Thank you.
And Jeff, fair to say that the enrollment cliff probably won't hit all the same way, right?
Right. And it's a slope. We call it a cliff. It's a slope that goes, but it does negatively impact Illinois, which is one of our big recruiting states. So we've looked at that as, maybe we need to pivot from Illinois if they're going to drop 31% on their graduating classes. So, but it's a slope. We call it a cliff, but it's a pretty constant slope is what we're looking at.
Jeff, is it too early to gauge the effectiveness of the free application period that we have in the fall?
Yeah, I would say so. I wouldn't know how to evaluate that. For us, it causes challenges because it's different from how we did in the past. So projecting what we're going to get when some of it's free and it wasn't before, that's some of the challenges we're running into is what is our enrollment actually going to be? How many people are applying everywhere and how many people are applying because they want to go here? That's the challenge we have with it is forecasting. So I don't think we have anything we could say one way or the other on it at this time.
Right. Thank you. Any other questions for Jeff this morning? All right. Thanks so much, Jeff. Great information.
Thank you.
All right. Next up from Kansas State University, Ethan Erickson. Good morning, Ethan.
Good morning, everyone. Happy snow day. Let me pull up the presentation real quick. Can everybody see my screen? Very good.
Yeah.
Let me Well, I think you're going to hear a lot of the similar themes as Jeff and Doug presented on. But before I jump into the numbers, I just wanted to kind of share a little bit of the major initiatives and some of the highlights we have underway at the university. We've obviously been under strategic planning. We completed our University Next Gen strategic plan a couple of years ago, and then all the colleges and major units have been crafting their own individual plans and determining their priorities and goals that align with that. And so, in particular, Administration of Finance, we've been under that process the last several months to understand kind of where we want to focus over the next 5 years or so. We also have recently updated our strategic enrollment plan. So about 5 years ago, we undertook probably our really first holistic and strategic enrollment plan. And it has, you'll see some increases in our enrollment here in a second. That has paid off, and it was time to touch up that plan. And so we've been completed that. And again, the individual colleges are working to craft their own plans that align with that. Planning is a theme that we're under right now at the university. So our campus master plan, we've been undergoing that process probably for about the last 12 months, and we anticipate that being complete later this summer or early fall, with an anticipated presentation to the board at the September meeting. We actually had a town hall to look at last night to look at the preliminary plan, and I think we had some real positive feedback on kind of the themes and directions that we're heading so far. We're also undertaking a true compensation study and career architecture look at the institution. It's probably our first time that we've ever really done a holistic review. And so we anticipate that also being complete late fall as well. That will help us understand kind of where we are with our workforce from a market perspective, and then give us an idea of how we can start tackling that. Similar to what Jeff has talked about, compensation is always a challenge for Kansas State. We're right in the midst of our Restoration Act planning. I'll touch on that in a second. And then you'll notice, particularly with Administration of Finance, the projects that really we have under our purview that we've been focusing on, we frame it as operational excellence. You can also call it continuous improvement, really aligned around standardizing processes and technologies so that we have sort of a uniform approach to how we undertake business. First up is a unified time and leave system. We were underway to get to a single time and attendance system at the institution before the cyber incident, and then that really has helped us coalesce around that project, and we anticipate that being live early in the summer. We're also unifying our staff performance management system, standardizing our computer workstation offerings. We also recently aligned our IT organization underneath the division of IT, and so the entire IT workforce reports up through that for a strong technical oversight of that workforce, but also then remains embedded within the colleges and major units so that they can continue to align with the individual needs of those areas. And then last step that we're working on is installing and implementing a unified badge access and camera system. So really a lot of those efforts that we're undertaking right now and investing in is around how do we unify and standardize what we're doing at the university. So diving into some of the specific numbers that we traditionally review, here's a quick look at our fall FTE by residency. And so what you can kind of see here is, we were under some declines all the way through to fall 2023. That was our first fall, and I think about 10 years that we saw an overall increase in our enrollment. And then we also saw a subsequent increase in the fall of 2024. And so you kind of see our resident population sort of remaining flat the last 2 years, but also our non-resident really increasing. A lot of that I would attribute to how we've adjusted our pricing model for our non-resident students, looking at tiered reduction in that non-resident rate all the way up to, depending on your academic achievement level, to where you can get to that in-state rate. And so we've seen some really strong positive return on that restructure. and also anticipate that continuing into the future years. Here's a look at our student credit hour production. You'll see, again, as enrollment kind of changes and you start seeing it trend up, you're going to start to see that credit hour production trend up as well. And you'll note, obviously, during the pandemic, we had a pretty strong, we increased our online offerings quite a bit. And then as we've returned to more normal operations, we're still having overall offering more online than we did prior to the pandemic. But we are starting to see that credit hour production, which is really where we align and understand what our total tuition revenue is for the institution. Speaking of tuition and fees, here's a quick look at where we stack up against our peer and aspirant institutions in total cost for tuition and fees based on a full-time resident undergrad student. So really aligned right in the middle of the pack in a lot of ways. And I think we've kind of maintained that position over time. We've obviously, we look at this every year as we undergo conversations internally about what type of a tuition rate increase we might want to pursue. But in addition to tuition and fees, we also want to look at our total cost of attendance when you include housing. And so we work with our students, and we obviously work with enrollment management to understand what type of a tuition rate increase we might propose and how that could impact us in the overall market. So we watch this very carefully as we go through our planning process. Switching through, and I apologize, this is a bit of an eye chart. This is a look at all of our general use line items. You can kind of see over the last several years, we've received, in addition to our normal operating line items, we have a significant number of specialized, special purpose line items for particular activities. And what we look at is what was the budget and where we stand as of the end of the fiscal year. And really, for the most part, what you'll see is we kind of align with where we would expect our expenditures to be by the middle of the fiscal year. A couple items I might point out that sort of fall below that 50% threshold that we would look for would be this line item for Ag Innovation Initiative. That's $25 million that we received from the state for the total $210 million Ag Innovation Initiative. But we also received some tranches of funds from the state that are ARPA flavored or federal flavored, and they don't show up in this. And so what we've been doing is spending those federal funds first sequentially, and then now we're starting to spend into that state funding pot by December. Fully anticipate we'll spend that out for those construction projects by the end of the fiscal year. There's a line item right below that you'll notice, again, we haven't spent as much as of the beginning of as of 12/31. That biosecurity research represents debt service. And so the way we structure our debt service payments at the institution is primarily interest is paid in the fall, so a much smaller payment. But then those final principal and interest payments come into the spring. And so again, we'll have that spent out by the end of the fiscal year. There's a couple others you might notice. We've got this Vet Med operating enhancement line. What we do though is if you float two lines up above, there's a Vet Med general operating. That's almost 100% spit out. So the way that college spends those dollars is it starts with operating, then flows to the operating enhancement, and then flows to tuition. So really working to spend those dollars out throughout the entire fiscal year. I'll flip to then sort of what you saw in a couple of the other presentations is looking at it by activity or program. And again, what you're seeing here really aligns with what I would anticipate for the fiscal year in terms of how we are spending our funds. You'll again note here our debt service that's funded from the general use budget floats in at about 9%. And oh, Elaine, I'm sorry. Let me flip. Let me see if I can flip to the. I just saw your note, Elaine. Let me see if I can flip to that view. How's that? Is that better? Let me get to the slide.
There we go. Yes. Thank you.
Sorry. Thought I tried that the first time. So catching back up, kind of where we were at with our spend by activity or program. If you look again, everything kind of aligns with where I would anticipate our spend to be at this point in the fiscal year. You'll notice again that debt service line item. Again, that's just the simple mechanics of how we structure our debt service payments at the institution, and so principal or interest in the fall, and then principal and interest later in the spring. Here's a trend look at our operating expenditures over a 5-year period. You'll note overall, we continue to recover from the pandemic, and you'll see a pretty big change again from 2023 to 2024. Begin looking at, and I'll talk a little bit about it when we look at our CFI, but investing back into the institution in ways, primarily looking at how are we investing in our salaries, but also in our institution at large. Couple big changes you'll see is a change in how we code our instruction versus research, but you'll also notice that research line has continued to change over the last several years. That partly is a result of us continuing to go back and work with our colleges and units about how we code our expenditures. And so the big change in that research line item between 2023 and 2024 is really a result of a cleanup in terms of coding and switching from instruction back to research. So those are some of the technicalities that come into how we code our expenditures back to the institution. Here's a look very similar to what everybody else has already presented. A big chunk of our overall operating expenditures is tied up in salaries, our people, 59%, and then breaking it back out into sort of that depreciation, scholarships, utilities, those types of things. So it's very similar to what you've seen at the other schools so far. We also like to present that look to say, how has funding changed? The funding mix between students and the state changed over time. Back to 2010, 2011, that threshold was crossed where the state used to finance more than the students do. And then you can kind of see that trend line change over time as our enrollment grew through about 2014, 15, and then started to decline over these last several years. That's really closed that gap in terms of our total general use budget between what the students and then what the state finances, to where you see that gap sort of continue to close together over time. Here's a look at our debt outstanding on the principal balances. And so you see continued drop from 2023 to 2024, where we project for 2025. So this is a look at by type of debt that we have. So breaking it out either between what is considered a student life building or housing to our academic buildings, and that could be anywhere from our architecture or our School of Engineering, the debt that we issued to do those major renovations. You'll notice we stayed flat, relatively flat between 2024 and 2025. And that's a result of we paid off a certain amount of debt, but we also anticipate that we will be issuing some debt this next year as we look at our strong complex, which we have issued for 2025, that was authorized by the board earlier this year. So here's a look at our debt burden ratio, which obviously you understand represents the percentage of operating expenses tied to debt payments. Goal is to remain below 7 in accordance with K-State or K-Board policy. We actually declined from 4.5 to 3.6 in 2024. The key reason behind that is our total operating expenditures increased, but we also didn't have any new debt in 2024. So overall, we saw the base increase a little bit that dropped our debt burden ratio. 2025, some of our key debt issuances that we will see is the Manhattan Housing Complex, the Strong Complex renovations for $25 million. We've already issued those, and that project's ongoing. A bit of a technicality, actually, is we were authorized to issue debt, about $41 million for the K-Airs facility. However, that was to be financed with a state general fund line item. As we've worked with the Department of Administration to do that debt issuance, they are actually going to take over that debt issuance and make it a state issuance and not a K-State specific issuance. And so they'll actually move the bonding authority and the bond payment out of our budget into theirs. And it actually benefits the institution because then it doesn't count as part of our debt burden ratio. Bit of a technicality, but something that kind of pops up here and there. We have obviously we went to the board in, I believe it was just November, December, to talk about the potential debt issuance for the Ag Innovation Initiative, the balance that potentially could occur between all the fundings that we've received from the state as well as philanthropic contributions, compared to the $210 million total budget for that project. We obviously are going to continue to fundraise and want to close that gap as much as we can to where we wouldn't have a gap and wouldn't have a need to issue this particular debt issuance. But it is a potential out there that would impact our debt burden ratio for FY 2026. If we look at our composite financial index, we decreased slightly from 5.58 in 2023 to 4.97 in FY 2024. Again, if you look at some of those key impacts for that decline, it's our cash position, changes in our debt levels, our operating expense fluctuations. But if you want to flip to a view that I like, is we've mapped, similar to what you saw, how I think Jeff and Doug showed the change in CFI. We like to show that, but map it back to that sort of chart that Troy talked about sort of demonstrating where your CFI maps into that overall strength chart, if you want to frame it that way. So we've gone all the way from 2018, where we were sort of in that 2 to 3 range, which was really low, I would argue, for the institution. We've continued to increase and grow that overall financial health of the university to where 2021 being a bit of an outlier because of the strong investment returns that all of us saw during the pandemic. We were at 5.58 in 2023, kind of our highest area, but you'll notice sort of the guidance that they give in this is to start looking at how do I focus some of my resources back into the institution. And so we looked at a lot of those areas to invest back into, especially around our salaries and benefits for the institution. And so we've used some of our cash to invest back into. We obviously need more support from the state as well to continue to sustain some of those pieces. But again, strong investment back into that sort of caused that drop in our CFI. I'll jump now to a couple other areas I just wanted to provide some updates on that, not particularly specific to metrics and the CFI, but also very impactful for our future planning at the university. We've talked about this when the board was last year, but we are actively undergoing planning for Campus Restoration Act. It's a huge opportunity that we see for us. Assuming the legislature keeps the bill as was originally approved, we would anticipate that K-State would receive around $53.8 million of Restoration Act funds over that 6-year period. And so we've worked to then think through how do we want to allocate those dollars back into the university to maximize the benefit. So we do have a plan to demo Schallenberger, which is part of our last commitment for the Ag Innovation Project, that once those buildings are built, Schallenberger will come down. We are one of our more top priorities that we have, especially from a philanthropic standpoint, would be Anderson Hall, renovating that. That particular effort also aligns with what we're hearing in our master planning process about how do we as an institution preserve some of our heritage buildings, Anderson Hall being one of the top ones that has been consistently noted. Then we're setting out quite a few of our dollars out to the institution to help generate interest in providing match opportunities, either from resources the colleges or major units may have available, but also their opportunity to connect with philanthropic donors. We're right in the midst of that RFP process, but our whole goal is to present the final plan hopefully by September for the board to consider ultimately what our plan is for those dollars. And then we have a carve out for Salina, and then we have a bit of a reserve. Just never know what might happen over 6 years. And so we try to keep a little bit of dollars held back for the unknowns. Another area that I wanted to touch on a little bit was how are we tackling our deferred maintenance challenge? I know that's a big focus for this particular body, but it's also a focus for the institution. Wanted to walk through a little bit about kind of where we were and where we are today. We have done a significant amount of work, a large number of projects. We are extremely thankful for the dollars that have come to us from the state since, in essence, 2023, those annual appropriations for both renovation and demolition. You'll see we started with mission critical buildings. Our backlog in 2023, which is sort of our baseline, was about 446 million. We've eliminated about $128 million in deferred maintenance for our mission critical facilities based on demolition projects. We have 8 demolition projects in that time period, $52 million reduction in deferred maintenance. We also had 48 individual projects spanning 2023 to 2025. That's about 73 million in reduction, to where we were able to get that backlog down to about 318 million. But then it's sort of swimming upstream, unfortunately, where we face inflation impacting our ability to sort of tackle that. And then also as systems age, that then increases our backlog. So while we've undertaken a significant amount of work, our backlog as it stands today for mission critical buildings is about 477 million. It's not, we're going to continue to chip away at this, but just wanted to kind of walk through for the body to help understand sort of where we stand today. Lots of work, but lots more work to do. One of the areas, again, focusing on facilities, is our space utilization effort that we've talked about here with the board especially. We're really proud of this. We've really worked hard, especially through those demolition projects. We've eliminated about 398,000 gross square foot of mission critical space by demolition projects. That has then resulted in downstream impacts for about 28% of our buildings on the mission critical list. And we've increased then our overall space utilization by about 7%. Just to give you a sense of the dominoes that come along with demo projects that also speak to why it takes so long to do a demo, but also speaks to kind of where we're at as an institution, where we've kind of hit a lot of our low-hanging fruit. If you just look at the Edwards demolition that we undertook, one building required us to touch 3 other buildings in preparation for moving people in and out. And so that effort then is, in order to demo Edwards, we had to renovate Dykstra and Stonehouse and the power plant, move those people in there, and then that allowed us to demo. So lots of different impacts that come along with the demo project, but we're really proud of our work and focus that we continue to have about how do we increase our mission critical space utilization over time. Touching on, and I think we have a lot of the same things that Jeff and Doug talked about as we look forward for fiscal challenges. Obviously, enrollment, their enrollment cliff or slope, as Jeff talked about. Our cybersecurity challenges that continue, and the investments needed into that infrastructure. Faculty, staff, recruitment, retention, challenges with paying people, but also paying people enough that they want to stay at the institution. Our aged infrastructure and facilities. And then Jeff kind of touched on it a little bit. The federal funding uncertainty has also thrown a bit of a unknown into our fiscal challenges. We were could also be potentially impacted with the NIH change, but we also had our USAID grant that received a stop order. But I think also is what's next. And that's an area that we just don't know what will be the next change that's sort of proposed by the federal government that could impact us as an institution. So we're also undergoing a lot of planning and dialogue internally to walk through potential impacts and how we might try to mitigate those at the institution. Obviously, from a risk mitigation standpoint, then our improved state funding is always helpful, but it's not yet sufficient to compensate that mitigate that pressure we have on compensation. And then I mentioned earlier, I started with all the operational excellence initiatives that we have, really trying to be as efficient as possible as we can with the various business processes that we have at the institution, and how do we be more more efficient overall as a university. So I'm happy to take any questions that the committee might have.
All right, thank you for the presentation, Ethan. Questions for Ethan this morning? All right,
Yes.
Regent Dykens.
Yeah, I think we talked about this last year, and just looking at the numbers that were presented today, the expenditures and the growth in those over the last 3 to 4 years. Yeah, is this sustainable, or where does it start to level off? But because it just, you look at the numbers and the growth in that every year, and throw in the fact that everybody mentions compensation. That's the initiative we're trying to work on with the legislature. And that's one of the areas that hasn't grown in the university's expenditures, but everything else has. That, we're not putting the dollars there. Where does this, plateau at some point? Because to me, it just doesn't seem like you can continue to expend like we are.
I think that's a great question, Regent Dykes. I might float back to this particular view that I showed. And again, I apologize, it's a bit of an eye chart. The number of special line items that we've received from the state for specific activities has grown pretty significantly over the last couple of years. So that's reflected in our increased expenditures that you're starting to see show up over here. But then you also see our research has grown quite considerably, not just because we're cleaning up, but also because we have been focusing heavily on increasing our research efforts as an institution. And then you'll notice our auxiliary enterprises is probably the last major line item that I would throw in there that would be inclusive of athletics. It's also inclusive of our housing and dining area. All of those have continued to sort of rebound, but also increase their expenditures since the pandemic. And so I agree with you. I think it's something that we always watch. When we plan internally, we look very conservatively at our GU budget in particular to make sure that we always maintain a balanced budget overall. And so that kind of is, I apologize, I'm not sharing my screen again, am I? Or no, I am.
Yeah, you got it.
Okay. I think especially when we're working internally, we always make sure that we have a balanced budget every year. And what I would say there is over the last 10 years, because we had that declining enrollment and our challenges as an institution, we reduced our budget on the GU side over $70 million and implemented cuts about, I think, 8 of 10 years. And so we work hard to make sure that we stay balanced, especially in that view. But then we also work with our other areas that sort of reflect to make sure that they're staying in balance as well.
Any other questions for Ethan this morning? Regent Winter, did you have a question?
Yes, thank you. Ethan, just a quick comment from you. Your enrollment increases are all the more impressive because you suffered some actual declines in a few years back. So you not only made up those declines, but have been on a track of actually adding back students. To what do you attribute that success, that movement?
Let me share my screen again. So, Regent Winter, if you kind of look, here is a look at our FTE by type. And so if you focus, you see our resident populations has sort of stayed steady, especially these last 2 years. But then if you look at our non-resident population, that's where we've seen quite a bit of our growth over the last couple of years. And I think I mentioned we a couple of years ago, we changed how we do our pricing for our non-resident students. We implemented a tiered pricing structure. So based on the student's academic achievement, they can receive a reduced tuition rate, discounted all the way to in-state for really high achieving students. We've also invested quite a bit of funds in our out-of-state recruitment markets, especially Missouri, Colorado, Nebraska, Texas. And I think those investments have also played out well for us as an institution to get our name out there and our brand out there to attract those out-of-state students. So we've worked really hard last couple of years to focus on out-of-state. I think what we can do is also continue to focus on our in-state population as well, so that we can grow that.
Thank you. Well, congratulations on that. It's really, really important stuff. Keep those students and that tuition, those tuition funds coming in, and you should be very proud of what you've done so far. I think you're well situated to continue to improve on that. Well done.
Yeah, that's well said. All right. Any other questions for Ethan? All right. Thank you, Ethan, and appreciate all the presentations this morning. Let's see, a couple of agenda items to cover still this morning. We have no discussion items on this afternoon's full board agenda, so would entertain any discussion related to the consent agenda. And if there is no discussion, would entertain a motion to approve the consent agenda for this afternoon.
Mr. Chair, I'd move to approve. This is Regent Rolfe.
We have a motion from Regent Rolfe, second by Regent Winter. All those in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Aye.
All right. Consent agenda is approved. All right. Monitor progress on State University Capital Renewal Initiative and Campus Restoration Act. I believe Director Bristow has a quick update for us this morning.
Thank you, Chair Benson. I think the two main things that we have to highlight this month were emphasized in the presentations today, and those are that the universities are developing their campus restoration plans that will be submitted to the board in September, and that work also continues in the effort to advocate for the legislature not to rescind any of the much needed funding for campus facilities.
Absolutely. That's well said. All right. Thank you, Director Bristow. Any questions for Chad this morning? All right. Hearing none. Vice President Frisbee, I don't believe we have any audits that we need to review this morning.
We do not.
All right. So I will just remind everybody that next conference call is our agenda planning call on February 25th at 12:15. If there are no other items for discussion this morning, we'll go ahead and adjourn the committee meeting. Appreciate everybody's time this morning. Lane, thank you to you and your team for making the virtual option possible for all of us. I believe Regent Winter has a question.
Just one clarification. I think the Zoom site or address for the whole board meeting is different, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
If you need that said to you again, Regent Winter, just let us know.
And we
You're
have
gonna be shocked
nothing.
at this, Elaine. I've still got it. I don't know if I
Okay.
can hold on to it for another hour, but I'll give it a shot.
All right, very good. Regent Dykes?
And we have nothing between now and 1:15 your time.
That's correct. You'll be back online 1:15.
Perfect.
All right. Well, thank you again to everybody this morning. Great information. And without any further ado, we'll adjourn and we'll see you all at 1:15 this afternoon. Thanks
Thank
again.
you.